Hei, olet lämpimästi tervetullut katsomaan Open Doorsin ohjelmaa Kristittyjen vainot tänään. Minä olen Mia Eklund ja kanssani täällä on Miika Auvinen.
Moikka! Kiva, että olet mukana meidän ohjelmassa. Open Doors on siis järjestö, joka palvelee vainottuja kristittyjä lähes 70 kohdemaassa, joissa kristittyihin kohdistuu vainoa tai syrjintää heidän uskon vakaumuksen takia. Me suomalaisina joskus ajatellaan, että kristittyjen vaino ei olisi totta, mutta tosiasia on se, että tälläkin hetkellä noin 360 miljoonaa kristittyä kokee vainoa vain sen takia, että he uskoo Jeesukseen. Ja heillä voi olla sama vakaumus kuin kristityillä meillä Suomessa, mutta ei samaa vapautta elää sitä todeksi.
Tämä ohjelma on 4. jakso Vaarallinen usko-ohjelmasarjastamme.
Apostolien teot lähtee liikkeelle siitä, kun pilvi vie Jeesuksen pois näkyvistä. Jeesuksen taivaaseen astuminen ei kuitenkaan merkinnyt hylkäämistä. Itse asiassa se oli osa Jumalan suunnitelmaa. Sillä Jeesus oli ennen taivaaseen astumistaan antanut opetuslapsille tehtävän. Menkää ja tehkää kaikki kansat minun opetuslapsikseni. Mua on aina ihmetyttänyt se, kuinka Jumala ei antanut tätä evankeliumia eteenpäin viemistä tehtäväksi vaikka enkeleille tai jollain tavalla henkivalloille vaan viedä sanoma Jeesuksesta kaikille ihmisille. Sen sijaan Jeesus antoi tämän tehtävän meille, vajavaisille, epätäydellisille ja syntisille ihmisille. Tällä seuraavalla videolla me tapaamme kiinalaisen kristityn, jota vainottiin vuosikymmeniä. Hän koki olevansa täysin yksin kaiken sen vainon keskellä, mutta tuli sitten lopulta näkemään Jumalan tarkoituksen kaikessa. Mä en tiedä, oletko sä tällä hetkellä siinä tilanteessa, että sä todella mietit, että miksi Jumala sallii niin monenlaista vastoinkäymistä sun elämässä.
Mennään katsomaan tämänkertainen jakso.
The book of Acts has a very bizarre beginning. Jesus disappears into thin air. And you think, well, what kind of a good idea can it be when Jesus gives the disciples their greatest task, which is to take the gospel to the ends of the earth, and then disappear into thin air? No wonder they kept on looking up at the sky, because they were alone with a world to win. And they might have felt a little deserted. And yet it's not desertion, it's design. It's Jesus' way of saying, now you go out and do the impossible things I did. I saw this at work through a Christian lady in China I once met. We called her Auntie Mabel, and she was a doctor in Beijing, very well known for her bright Christian witness. But when the communists came to power in 1949, everything changed for her. She was evicted from her large house, and she was forced to live in her garden shed. And because she was well known as a Christian, she was targeted. She was stripped of her doctor's post, and she shoveled sand in a work gang. That's what they asked her to do. And then when the Cultural Revolution got going, the teenagers, the Red Guards, were given power over her, and they came to her, they beat her up, they paraded her in the streets, and they put this large sign outside her house saying no one must speak to her because she has distributed Bibles. And that's not allowed in the new China. That's anti-Mao. And so she was shunned. No one would talk to her. And this was harder for her than being beaten and being put into jail. She said, I descended into hell. And she said, one night I came back, I went into my little kitchen, and she said, I've had enough. I'm an old lady. I've had a good life. God won't mind me coming to heaven early. So she took a large knife, and she held it over her wrist, and she said one last prayer before she brought it down. She said, Lord, if this is wrong, help me. Well, she never brought the knife down. She put it away. She burst into tears. and she endured another 8 years of beatings and isolation and victimization. She said, no angel appeared and whipped the knife out of my hand. She said, somehow God gave me the strength to go on, but I never knew how. And she said, all the time, I was always asking Jesus to make an appearance to me. Come to me. Put your arms round me. Why must you be so invisible? She cried. And many years later, she knew why. Because in the late 70s, after Mao had died, China began to put the excesses of the Cultural Revolution behind it, and the Red Guards were disbanded. But Mabel wasn't restored to her house. But even in her little garden shed, she began to receive a stream of visitors. And many of these visitors were very high-ranking members of the Communist Party. She recognized their faces from the newspaper. And even more astonishingly, they all had one question: do you have any Bibles? And she was saying, oh, why are you coming to me out of all the people in Beijing? Why'd you come to my house? And they would say, well, we remember during the Cultural Revolution, there was a large sign outside your house that contained all your crimes. And one of them said that you were guilty of distributing Bibles. I'm just here on the off chance that you might have some left. And so that sign that caused her such misery launched her ministry. It had kept people away from her during the Cultural Revolution, but after she had endured, it drew them. And Mabel was able to contact Open Doors. We smuggled Bibles to her, and she became the first distributor of scriptures in China's capital again. She was a vital supplier. And even today, there are high-ranking members of the Communist Party who owe their faith to her endurance. And she said, well, it's been nice to know why. It helps my faith. But she said, it was hard. Every day was hard. And she said, I never seemed to get that prayer answered of, Lord, please appear for me. But she said, I see that this was for the best, because she said, if Jesus had come to me, I wouldn't have done the impossible. He would have overshadowed me. He would have controlled me. But in not being there, he was giving me the space to do the impossible through his power. That's not desertion, she said. It's generosity. You will receive power, he said, after I'm gone up to heaven. That's what he said to the disciples. So the cloud that hides him from our sight is not a disaster. It's design. Sure, the disciples must have felt bereft. But Jesus is really saying, I'll send the Spirit, and we will do all these things together, through each of you, in a new and beautiful way. So we get invited to be his partners, or the theologians say, co-creators. He wants us to do what he did to an even greater degree. Jesus ascends to give us the space to do the impossible for him and through him. Now that means space to fail, space to struggle, space to be unsure. And the characters in the book of Acts, they have their doubts and their disagreements and their struggles. And if Jesus had stayed, there would have been none of that. When they have to decide in Acts 15 in the council, should the Gentiles become Christians or not, or be allowed to become Christians or not, Jesus would just have appeared and told them what to do. But he didn't. He let them struggle. He let them figure it out. Or when Paul was having his disagreement about who to take on a trip with him, and Barnabas and he actually had such a violent disagreement, they went their separate ways. Jesus would have sorted that out. If he'd stayed behind, he would just have said, Paul, take so-and-so. Barnabas, you just deal with it. And yet that didn't happen. They got the power to decide. They got the power to, in a sense, create the will of God and live out the gospel in a much more intimate way. So even our failures, even our difficulties, even our struggles become the means in which God spreads the gospel through us, just like Mabel. That horrible sign outside her house, it was a mark of humiliation. But actually, because she endured in the power of Christ, it was the means of her wonderful ministry. And that's a lady who did that marvelous job for Christ in her 80s. So we're never too old to do a remarkable work for Christ. When Mabel looked back over her life, she can say, I did that. I endured with Christ's help and brought Bibles to Beijing. Mabel thought that terrible notice board was the end of her, and it was in a sense, but only so that God could make another beginning through her. And a cloud still hides Jesus from our eyes for all of us, so that we get the same opportunity to do the impossible in his power. It's a risk. What a plan. But what an opportunity.
Tämä oli tosi koskettava video. Miika, miten sä ajattelet, että Jumalan voima voi näkyä kaikissa kamppailuissa ja epäonnistumisissa?
Mä ajattelen, että ehkä Jumalan voima nimenomaan näkyy heikkoudessa. Siitä itse asiassa apostoli Paavalikin aika usein puhuu, että Jumalan voima tulee täydelliseksi heikkoudessa. Mä en tiedä minkälaisista vaivoista, oliko se fyysinen sairaus vai niin kuin oman tunnon tuskat siitä, että aikanaan Paavali, joka meille näyttäytyy apostolina ja tämmöisenä suurena lähetystyöntekijänä, niin hän oli itse asiassa vainonnut kristittyjä aikaisemmin. Se varmasti oli aika kipeä asia sen jälkeen, kun hän oli saanut itse kohdata Jeesuksen. Mutta joka tapauksessa hän puhuu paljon siitä, että hänen heikkous, niin sen Jumala on kääntänyt ja kääntää vahvuudeksi. Ja tässä maailmassa tälläkin hetkellä, niin kuin toi Mabelin tarina tuossa äsken, mistä kuultiin kiinalaisesta uskon sisaresta, joka eli vuosikausia epätoivon vallassa ja hänelle ikään kuin oli häpeä se, että hänen kotonaan oli jaettu raamattuja ja että hän oli kristitty, niin hän kommunistisessa Kiinassa joutui todella kantamaan koko yhteisön häpeää harteillaan. Mutta sitten sen jälkeen just kaikista korkeimmat kommunistiviranomaiset tuli hänen luokseen hakemaan ja kysymään häneltä salaa raamattuja myöhemmin, koska he ajattelivat, että tässä luki hänen häpeätaulussaan luki todella, että tämä nainen on jakanut raamattuja. Tälläkin hetkellä monissa maissa itse asiassa kristityt on merkattuja. He on tavallaan heillä on semmoinen häpeätahra, stigma, joka määrittää heidän identiteettiään. Mutta yön pimeydessä ihmisiä tulee heidän luokseen ja kysyy, että opeta mua tuntemaan Jeesus, kerro mulle lisää raamatusta. Tänä päivänä esimerkiksi Malediiveillä, joka on yksi tämmöinen muslimaa, niin moni malediiviläiskristitty saattaa menettää koko Malediivien kansalaisuuden, jos käy ilmi, että hän on kääntynyt islamista kristityksi, koska se on siinä maassa laitonta. Ja silti, niin kuin Malediiveilläkin, on salassa eläviä kristittyjä, jotka on valmiit heittää kaiken menemään sen takia, että he saa olla osallisia Jumalan valtakunnasta.
Toivottavasti myös nämä todistukset puhuttelevat sinua. Tule kanssamme rukoilemaan näiden ystävien puolesta. Jatketaan tästä ensi viikolla. Nähdään silloin. Moikka!
Moi moi!